Hi guys, and welcome back to another painting tutorial. So I'm really excited to share this one with you today. I decided to do a somewhat similar colour scheme to my old Eldar colour scheme for FUEGAN. So starting off, I'm just going to do a base coat of corn red. Now I am using my airbrush for this, and it's one of only 2 times I'll be using the airbrush in this tutorial. And it was really just to save a little bit of time on the base coat. If you are applying this by brush, of course, though, just do 2 thin coats of corn red, see how that's looking, and do a third if you need to. Next up, I'm just going to carefully shade in all of the armor using corn red and Abaddon black, looking at a 50-50 mix for this, and I'm also using my RAPHAEL 8404 size 30 brush for this, as I really wanted to carefully apply this as opposed to just doing an all over shade, which is actually what I used to do. So with my old color scheme for the red armor, I used to just do a wash of Carroburg Crimson over the entire miniature. But yeah, decided I wanted the scheme to look a little bit cleaner this time around, which is why I decided to do it this way. Now, just to mention as well, this is, of course, it being a shade. I have watered it down quite a bit, so just make sure that you water it down enough that it's not obviously running completely watery, but just to maximize the control and just to limit how strong the final color is. But if you are wanting to have the recesses quite dark, you can, of course, do a couple of layers of this. Now, as you can see, I've painted in one of the shoulder plates of the armor, and I just wanted to see how it would look. And now moving on to the rest of the armor. So next up for the first highlight, I'm just going to use some WAZDAKKA red. Again, just using the same brush as before. And I'm just going to begin very carefully highlighting all of the armor. Now this is quite time consuming, but this is a centerpiece model along with all of the Phoenix Lords in my opinion. So it's definitely worth just taking your time. And it's also a really good opportunity to get this really fine sort of edge highlighting practice in as well. Now for the second highlight, I decided to use Wild Rider red. And again, really just following over all of the WAZDAKKA red. This is certainly one of my favorite reds. It's just really beautiful and vibrant. And you'll certainly see that the red armor is coming together quite nicely after applying the Wild Rider red. So again, minimal paint on the brush, really does take your time. And just gradually work up those colors. As you can see as well, I'm using my wet palette for this. When I used to paint Elder years ago with a similar color scheme to this, I didn't use a wet palette, and it was pretty painful, to be honest. Just because the paints were dry and you're constantly putting more paint out, so I definitely recommend picking up a wet palette. And as a final touch for all of the red armor, I decided to use Fire Dragon Bright. Now this is quite a jump between that and the previous highlights, however, it'll really draw out the colour and the overall colours and give it a really nice vibrant finish. And I'll be limiting the Fire Dragon Bright a little bit more to just edge highlighting, and just to really draw out all of the other colours as well. As you definitely still want to see some of that WAZDAKKA red and Wild Rider red, and of course the KHORNE red, as they're all really nice colours as well, but this is just to really draw a lot of focus to the red armour. And this step here is really just a continuation of the armor, as I wanted to include just a little bit more of, you know, sort of the highlighting of different parts of the armor. But if you felt as though you got enough from the last part of the tutorial, you can of course skip over this part if you want to. So as you can see, I also painted in the banner, following the exact same steps as the armor. However, I didn't finish with Fire Dragon Bright on that. So just did the WAZDAKKA red highlight, and of course those shades of the Khorne red and Abaddon black, and then just finished with a little bit of Wild Rider red. And as you can see, I'd already painted the dragon on the other side. I just wanted to test it out a little bit. So now moving on to the other side, I'm going to start working in some Stegadon scale green, and essentially just using this as a sort of thick highlight to start with, and then moving on to the other colors, but just make sure that you leave some of that black visible. Just to mention as well, I didn't include it in the tutorial as I didn't think it was overly important, but you can see that I have filled out all of the non-red parts with black as well. So any black acrylic will do just fine, however I did use Abaddon black. Next up, I'm just going to further highlight the dragon with SOTEK green. So just make sure that you leave some of that Stegadon scale green visible, and just work sharp edge highlights using the SOTEK green. Next up is Temple Guard Blue, and again really just following over the SOTEK green. So just using the tip of your brush and just carefully applying those highlights. And as a final touch, I decided to use a mix of Temple Guard Blue and heavy titanium white. So a 50-50 mix of this, and as always, any white acrylic will do just fine. This is just my preferred one. And just carefully working in some final edge highlights, again just to draw more attention to the details overall. Next up, for the, I suppose, the moon on the banner, I decided to use some INCUBI darkness. So once again, just really carefully applying this around the edges of the moon. And then I'm just going to follow up with a highlight of KABALITE green. Now this was fairly time consuming, this part, as I just really wanted to take my time and make sure that I got as clean of an application as I could. And as you can see as well, I haven't really worried about the center of the moon. I was happy for that to be black, especially with all of the other details surrounding it. And now just an additional highlight of SYBARITE green. And as you can see, I made a little mistake there, and I'm just really quickly removing the paint with my brush. So whenever that happens, one thing I like to do is to, for example, if the paint overlaps into another detail, I really quickly wash away the brush, or even just sort of lick the paint off, and then I quickly remove it, just using the brush that obviously no longer has any paint on it. And as a final touch for the moon, I decided to use some GAUSS Blaster Green. And fairly limited with this highlight, just working it around the top edges of it. And now just going back to WAZDAKKA Red, Wild Rider Red, and of course Fire Dragon Bright. So I'm just going to base coat in WAZDAKKA Red for all of the flames. And for each of the scales as well, well I should say actually, so for every second scale, use the WAZDAKKA Red, the Wild Rider Red, and of course Fire Dragon Bright, and then for all of the other scales, I just used the same colours that I used for the moon. So as you can see, just while I was applying the red onto those scales, it gave it a reasonable amount of time for the WAZDAKKA Red to dry, so I then applied a second coat. And now moving on to Wild Rider Red, I'm just going to edge highlight all of the scales. All of the red scales, I should say. And then just edge highlight all of the flames as well. And then of course just finishing with Fire Dragon Bright. So really just on the tips of the flames and on the tips of those scales as well. And then once again, just using the STEGADON Scale Green, SOTEK Green, Temple Guard Blue, and the Temple Guard Blue White mix, just for the rune on the banner. So as you can see overall with the rune, with each progressive highlight, just try and use less and less, and then just finish with the Temple Guard blue and white mix, just as dot point edge highlights. Next up, once again using the exact same colours as was previously used on the runes, and of course the dragon, I'm now going to work on all the tabards. And again, sort of thinking back to my old Eldar scheme, I wanted to add a little touch of that sort of galaxy effect. It's just something that I really enjoy painting, and I really loved when I came up with this color scheme, in that I loved the vibrancy of the red-orange and the blue-green finish, which, if you look at a color wheel, they're actually perfectly matched, and in my opinion, just the overall look of the color scheme, I just really like the way the colors contrast together, and just something a little bit different as well. And don't really worry too much about allowing the colours to dry too much. I was happy for these colours to blend. It is entirely up to you though if you do decide to use this scheme. So just really carefully applying those edge highlights. And as you can see, the SOTEK green as well is a much thinner line than the STEGADON scale green. And once again, just following along those SOTEK green highlights using Temple Guard blue. And then just a final touch of the Temple Guard blue and white 50-50 mix. And just to mention as well, the steps here that you've seen on the tabard, they do also apply for the belts and the pouches and of course the gun. I just wanted to mention as well, I did actually film the gun, however I unfortunately deleted the footage without realizing that I hadn't yet transferred it over to my computer, so apologies that the gun won't be included. However, just to mention, the colors for the gun were exactly the same as the helmet, the tabard, and all of the other blue-green finishes as well. So now moving on to the helmet, and of course with the base coat of Abaddon Black already applied, I'm just going to edge highlight with STEGADON scale green. So just make sure that this first highlight is fairly, the lines are applied fairly thick. And then of course with each progressive highlight, we'll just do a little less each time. Now moving on to SOTEK green once again, I'm now going to begin base coating in all of the lightning. So it's really important that you have a really nice paint consistency with this, so add a reasonable amount of water. And if you're unsure of how to paint lightning, just definitely have a reference in front of you. Make sure that you're using a really small detail brush, such as the one that I'm using in this tutorial. Just as a reminder, which is the RAPHAEL 8404 size 30 brush. It's, in my opinion, the perfect size brush for details such as lightning, painting eyes. At the moment, I do tend to use it for more details than I probably should, but it is just my favorite brush at the moment. A size 1 though, or a size 0 brush would work really well as well. It really just comes down to personal preference, and once you've sort of trial and errored different brushes. But it's really important when painting lightning just to create a reasonable amount of variation. So as you can see, if you look through the center of the lightning pattern, none of them are really the exact same shape, and that's what I was going for. But this isn't something that you should expect to get the first time you do it. You know, when I first started painting lightning, it didn't really look sort of like natural lightning, and I still personally don't really think I'm all the way there yet. But I'm really happy with the progress if I look back on some lightning effects that I used to do. And another thing to remember when painting details like that, again, this is really just my opinion, but they shouldn't really overshadow the rest of the details on a miniature. Which is why, for example, when painting lightning, try and make it as small as you can, depending on the scale of the miniature. But obviously on a model the size that FUEGAN is, you can't really get away with doing them too large, otherwise they won't look as natural. So yeah, just a few things to consider, but really what it ultimately comes down to, again in my opinion, is that practice will eventually come close to perfect. So just keep putting in the effort, and always enjoy what you're doing as well. And next up, I'm just going to move on to Temple Guard Blue. And I'll once again be following over those edge highlights and also working in some details in the lightning as well. So I don't want to go over all of the SOTEK green. However, just trying to meet some of the edges of it there. And also just working it through the center as well. And now just to finish all of the edge highlighting, I decided just to use straight white and also just to do all of the dot points throughout the lining. Next up, once again using all of the same colours as before, I'm just going to begin by edge highlighting the axe. So just carefully applying the Stegadon scale green around the entirety of the axe, just making sure that we're leaving some of that Abaddon black as well. And next up, just using SOTEK green, once again just following over all of the Stegadon scale green. And I'm also going to work the SOTEK green through the center of the rune and just on the outside of the rune as well. Next up, I'm just going to use Temple Guard Blue once again, and following over all of the previous edge highlights. And once again as well, just using the Temple Guard Blue and White mix, I'm just going to finish the center of the rune, just to add some vibrancy to it. And as you can see, I did make a little bit of a mistake there, as some of the Temple Guard Blue and White mix bled over. So I've just quickly tried to wipe it away with my finger, and whatever you can't get, just go back to the previous colors and touch it up. So for example, it overlapped a little bit too much into the black for my liking, so I've just gone back to a Baden black, and I'm just going to touch that up quickly. And then if you need to as well, just go back to the Temple Guard Blue, and just tidy up the edge highlight once more. So next up, I decided to use some greens for the lenses and all of the gemstones. So just using some Caliban green, I'm just going to base coat in for the lenses to begin with. Next up, I'm just going to mix a little bit of Warpstone Glow and Caliban Green together, just to gradually build up the first highlight. And then I'm just going to move straight onto Warpstone Glow on its own. And as I mentioned earlier as well, you really don't have to worry so much. If you're going for a little bit of a wet blend, you really don't have to worry so much about allowing any dry time, as I was more than happy for these colors to blend together a little bit. Next up, I'm just going to use some Mood Green, and with each progressive highlight, especially with lenses, just try and make the lines thinner and thinner with each one. So really just trying to focus on the very front of the lens, and then just gradually working it back toward the back of the lens as well. But again, really just on the edges. Don't panic too much if you make a mistake, as you can very well go back to a Baden Black and just work in those recesses if it does overlap a little bit. And now just a final touch at the front, I'm just going to use some Mood Green and again some heavy titanium white, looking at a 50-50 mix. Just at the very front of the lens. And as always with lenses, just to create a little bit of reflection, I'm just going to use a small dot of white. Now, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in a previous tutorial, but one thing I like to do when doing this, when you put down your pool of white paint, keep one side of it fairly thick and the other side heavily watered down. And what I like to do is very lightly dip the tip of the brush in the thick side, and then just to help with the application, then dip it in the more watered down section. As you can see, it doesn't work every single time the first time round, but it does get there in the end. And it's one of those things that's absolutely worth just being as careful as you can and taking as much time as you can, as you don't want those dots, reflective dots, to be too thick. And now just following over with the exact same steps for all of the gemstones. And now just to add a little bit of a star field on all of the tabards, I decided to use some Temple Guard Blue and again with the white going for a 50-50 mix, just to help it be a little bit more subtle as opposed to just using straight white. So I'm first just going to paint in some stars. So just try and get the vertical and horizontal lines nice and clean, and then just add in a few diagonal lines as well. It's really important when painting stars that you have a really smooth paint consistency as well, and to also try and aim to have the vertical and horizontal lines longer than the diagonal lines. And I didn't want to overdo it considering how small the tabards are for Fuegan. I decided just to keep just a couple of them, and then the rest I'll just be doing some little dot stars essentially. And as always with these as well, just try and spread them out to make them look a little bit even, sort of like you would see in real life when you look up at the night sky. And of course have some smaller and have some larger as well. So now moving on to the base, I had already base coated down some STEGADON scale green, and I decided just for a little bit of speed of application, I decided to use SOTEK green through the airbrush, and this is the second and last time I'll be using my airbrush in this tutorial. And you can absolutely apply this with a brush. If you are applying it with a brush, I would recommend you could either sponge on the SOTEK green, or you could just dry brush it on as well. But for the helmet at the front and the flames, I would recommend just painting it on. And as you can see, I'd already painted in some of the details on the Chaos helmet. Now all that was a batten black and then a single base coat of Viking gold by scale 75. The reason I kept it so basic is because now, as you can see, I'm going over all of it to create a little bit of OSL with the flames. And I also decided to mix some LAHMIAN medium with the Temple Guard Blue. And next up, essentially just following over the same details, however, trying with each progressive highlight to just focus more on the recesses, the deepest recesses of the flames, I should say. And also for the helmet to create the effect as though it's sort of burning from the inside out. You know, the intensity of the heat is coming from the center of the helmet, for example. That's sort of what I was going for there. And just to be sure that you apply a couple of coats of this, so considering it is effectively a shade, definitely allow a little bit of drying time between each coat. And if you want to go brighter and brighter, you can just continuously add more white to the previous mix until you get up to white. And then just for the tips of the flames, I decided to use some batten black, and this is fairly thinned down, and just really trying to apply that carefully at the tips of the flames. And once again, just with the previous mix, so Temple Guard Blue and the Heavy Titanium White. However, I just added a little bit more white to it this time, and really just focusing at the absolute recesses of the details. So where the flame would meet the center of the helmet, essentially. And for a little added glow around the lenses as well. And as you can see, I've already applied the white pumice texture paint by Vallejo. And now I'm just going to shade all of that in using KROXIGOR scales, contrast paint by Citadel. So there's no real need to water this down, and just using it straight from the pot, I'm going to apply that over all of the texture paint. Now just be mindful with white pumice texture paint. I found that even when applying darker contrast paints over it, you might occasionally find that there are some white spots. So after it's dried, just have a quick look around the texture paint to make sure that there are none of those little white spots showing. But if there are, just apply a little bit more in those spots. So keeping the base fairly simple, I decided just to finish the base using Skink Blue Dry. This is one of Citadel's dry paints, and I'm just going to dry brush all of the details on the base, with the exception of the helmet and the flames, of course. And just to finish off all of the remaining details, I decided to keep the gold fairly simple. However, I knew that the gold would contrast really well with the red, so I decided just to use a base coat of Viking gold. Now, I still recommend using a fine detail brush for this, considering how small the miniature is, especially the details that are remaining for all of the gold details. And one little recommendation I stumbled across a little while ago is that yes, you definitely can obviously use fine detail expensive brushes. You can use metallics for them. However, a really good way of giving them a deeper clean is to actually use airbrush cleaner. Now, I don't really personally know the science behind that. However, I have since tried it as opposed to using the regular Masters brush cleaner that I use, and I've got to say it really does work well. So airbrush cleaner is really affordable, and I recommend picking it up just to help give those brushes a deeper clean. So now just quickly moving on to chestnut ink, and I have watered this down a little bit after having applied the Viking gold, of course, and just shaded all of the gold And as a final touch for all of the gold, I decided to use ELVEN Gold by Scale 75. Once again, just using the exact same brush as was used throughout the rest of the tutorial, just to carefully pick out some highlights. And here are some completed photos of FUEGAN. I had an absolute blast painting this model, and I actually picked up all 4 of the new Phoenix Lords, and I have already built Azurman, so he'll be the next one on the to-do list. I'm working on a couple of other things as well. But I really hope you found this tutorial useful today. If you did, hit that like button, leave a comment below of something that you might like to see me do in the near future, subscribe if you haven't already. If you would like to support the channel further, the links are in the description below. It doesn't cost you anything, just if you're planning on buying any of your hobby needs. So thank you very much. I will see you again in the next one.